Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar, Insider Threats, How to Find Them Early and Fix Them Fast. It's brought to you by SpectorSoft and Dark Reading and broadcast by United Business Media Limited. I'm Kim Davis, I'll be your moderator today, and we have just a few announcements before we begin. The webcast will contain audience polling. The polling question will appear in the slide presentation window. Please complete the polls when they appear and click on the Submit Answer button located on the polling slide window. We'd like to thank you in advance for participating in that. You can also participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the webinar. Just type your question into the Q&A text area located to the right of the presentation window and then click the Submit button. And we do recommend that you disable your pop-up blockers. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You can download a copy of the slides by clicking on the Additional Resources button located below the presentation window. And if you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webinar help guide by clicking on the help link below the presentation window. In addition, you can contact technical support. The helpline is also located in the webinar help guide. But now on to today's presentation, Insider Threats, How to Find Them Early and Fix Them Fast. Discussing today's topic is Mike Tierney. He's the Chief Operating Officer at SpectorSoft, responsible for the day-to-day operations of the company, and he also works extensively on product strategy and product marketing. Joining Mike is Jim Meyer. He's the Managing Director of Coordinated Response, firm specializing in developing and automating incident response plans. So whenever you're ready, I hand over to you.
Thanks, Kim. This is Jim Meyer. And the key question is, what is incident response? The SANS Institute says it's an organized approach for managing a security breach or attack, and they define 6 steps. Preparation, which should include plan development, the necessary policies to govern the plan, and practice. Then you have the tools, the people, and the procedures to identify, contain, eradicate, and recover. And of course, at the end, you should look back and look for lessons learned. But let's filter that with the incident being an insider incident. Your policies are going to have to be in place, especially if you're monitoring activity of key users. And containment may include seizing devices. Eradication may be tricky, and recovery may require legal action or employee termination. So this clearly requires an added level of governance. We have a poll question for you. Does your company have a formal incident response plan?
Okay, and I'll just give people a chance to look at that and respond to it. Just click yes or no and hit Submit Answer.
Mike, do most of your customers have an incident response plan when you start working with them?
That's a good question, Jim. And I think we see a mix of companies that have, at times, very sophisticated incident response plans. And then we also see other people that are reaching out to us while they are in the process of standing up either a plan or a team to implement that plan and manage it. So we see a pretty good mix, and I think that's, I couldn't have asked for a better segue. That's pretty reflected in the poll results.
Okay, so we have 51.3% saying yes, 48.6% saying no, and I think we can continue.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim. So this is Mike. I got it, Jim. And as Jim mentioned, the insider risk and insider threat requires a little bit of a different look at inside incident response planning. So I wanted to take a moment and just really couch, when we say insider threat, what are we talking about? And as you can see, I'm a man that's not afraid of white space on some slides. At the end of the day, an insider threat is somebody that has been given access properly and used it improperly. This might be an employee, a former employee, a contractor, a business partner. It's somebody that trust was established with. They were brought in and given access to systems. That presents unique challenges in dealing with when that trust is violated. Systems that look for improper access can't help you because they've been given access. Systems that deny access can't help you because, again, they have the keys. And I think, it kind of begs the basic question. If background checks and interviews are sufficient to determine that a person is trustworthy, why do we keep reading and hearing about all these insider problems? Which, as a follow-on question for me, is why is checking on someone only done at the time of hire, or commonly only done at the time of hire? What I've found in my role here and over time in my career is that life happens, people change, situations change, people make mistakes. And I think that there needs to be a greater degree of focus on the actions of insiders and on maintaining that level of scrutiny on folks. Just because they pass the security checkpoint in the airport, we don't exist in that sealed environment anymore. So we need to continue to look at them. So from a sort of a definition perspective, just to sum that up and to keep in your back of your mind as we go, we're talking about folks that have been given access and used that access improperly. I think Jim's going to run through a little bit of what we're talking about in a little bit more detail with some numbers.
Okay, this is the 2012 Cybersecurity Watch survey. The survey is conducted by CERT at the Carnegie Mellon University and Deloitte Consulting. It's sponsored by CSO Magazine and the U.S. Secret Service. An important thing, it has 480 respondents back in 2012. Large companies represent about 30%. Small companies under 500 employees represent about 40%. So it's a very representative survey. And you'll notice on the slide, from year to year, it goes from a low of 41% to a high of 53%. So what that tells you is you have a 50-50 chance of experiencing an insider threat in the next 12 months. How does that feel? Mike?
Yeah, I don't imagine that feels pretty good. So, we kind of looked a little bit at the numbers on the amount or the size of the problem and how common it is. If we drill into that a little bit closer and look inside a company, what are the types of insider threats that we're talking about here? The top four bullets on this slide should look pretty familiar. They're kind of classic insider threat, and we're going to talk about the impacts of them over the next couple of slides. There's a lot of issues inside a company. These are categorically some of them that you see. I've listened to one IDC analyst who segments insider threats into three categories: inadvertent, mischievous, and malicious. And you could certainly see how a data breach could be inadvertent. A privileged user could in a mischievous way do something to a system that could cause a problem. And then you can obviously malicious behind a lot of these things. The one on the slide I wanted to talk to for a minute was inappropriate behavior, because I don't know that that's one that people readily look at and say, yeah, that's an insider threat. But if you go back to that definition of access used improperly, if an employee uses the access you, in your role as a company person, gave to them to, let's say, harass a fellow employee, to create an unfriendly work environment, you as a company are going to have liability issues. You're probably going to have productivity and morale issues, and you likely have a flight risk on your hands, which is not only going to cost dollars in terms of replacement and additional lost productivity, but departing employees have a bad habit of taking IP with them when they leave, and we'll talk a bit more about that, but that certainly would then tie back up into IP theft and data leak. So for me, and from what I've seen as we go out and we talk to our customers and to folks in the industry, inappropriate workplace behavior fully belongs in the realm of insider threat. looking a little bit more inside a company, the departments you see represented up on this slide are the ones that, according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, see the most incidences, and when I say the most, I mean overwhelmingly, of fraud committed inside a company. So what we wanted to do as we start to talk about the impacts is also start to highlight potential areas of concern. So as you evaluate your incident response plan, or for half of you if you're looking to stand them up, especially as they pertain to insider threat and insider risk, you can focus in the right places. One of the things I talk about frequently is that there's a language of fraud, and there are widely known phrases and ways of communicating that people use that show up in the communications fabric of a company. The question is, are you watching for it, are you listening for it, and are you looking in the right places? These 6 departments on the screen represent 77% of all the frauds committed inside of companies, which is a shocking number, and it really points you in the right places to look if you want to detect fraud early and be able to deal with it. That data comes to us from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, again, which is a great source for a lot of information on fraud, which I find to be a particularly insidious form of insider threat. Moving forward, as we talk about insider threats and some of the impacts, we talk about data leak and data breach and IP theft. The numbers up on the screen pretty much speak for themselves. This was a semantic survey. We've done surveys our own, and the numbers were pretty much identical to semantics. What this tells me is that folks, we have a problem, and the problem is us. The problem is people. And it may be, as I referenced earlier, inadvertent or mischievous or malicious, but at the end of the day, people are very difficult to secure. Now, there are ways that you can address people issues. It's not okay to transfer documents to a personal device. You can deal with that at training. You can do it at hire. You can do regular refreshes. Sometimes you might need to be able to call out an example and say, look, we know that you're doing this and you're violating company policy and you're putting the company at risk. If you can detect them, you can do that. And I've always believed that you need to inspect what you expect. So if you put a policy in place or you train somebody on something, you need to actually look and watch and make sure that that's sunk through. I talked a little bit about the bad habit that people have of taking data when they leave. There's the stat on the slide. Half the folks think it's okay to do that. And a full 40% of those folks, and the number's not up on the slide, use it at their next company, which is pretty shocking. One of the things I've talked about in the past is, just taking this out of technology. If you were going to have a party at your house and somebody told you before the party started that half your guests were going to take something with them when they left your party, and you hadn't really been planning on goodie bags at the end of the party, you'd probably keep an eye on the folks with the keys in their hands to make sure that Grandma Silver was not walking out the door. It's the same thing in our corporate world. If people are getting ready to leave the company, statistically speaking, 1 out of 2 is going to take something with them that they're not supposed to. We need to put eyes on that problem, I believe. And the last thing I'd say here, just really quickly, is that 70% of insider IP theft occurs when the insider is on site. And I know a lot of times people will try to flag for access from internal systems or for odd hours and types of things. The majority of the time this is happening during the workday. It's happening when they're at their desk. So it makes it even a little bit harder to detect. If you look at the impacts of this, we talk about data leak a little bit and IP theft. If you look at a data breach and the impacts on a company when they are breached, and let's put aside all of the fines that people can incur and those types of expenses, and just look at what happens to a company's reputation. A fifth of customers terminate their relationship with companies. 3/5 of customers are at risk. If you add that 40% and that 19%, and I am rounding a little bit, 60% of your customers are at risk if you have a data breach. The only word that I can use when I see stats like that is ouch. And when I talk about data leaks and talk about data breaches, a lot of times people will say to me, Mike, you're not selling DLP. Your solutions look at what people do. Why are you talking about this? Just real quickly, in 2010, $370 million was spent on DLP solutions. In 2014, Gartner projects $941 million will be spent on DLP. It's a fast-growing industry. And I like DLP and I like the solutions and the value they bring. But then I can also look at numbers that say from 2011 to 2012, we saw a 16% increase in reported leaks, and that was on an increase of $115 million in spend. In the first half of 2013, there was an 18% increase in reported leaks year over year, and spend was looking to be up about $160 million. It doesn't take a sophisticated financial mind to know that's bad return on investment from a macro level. And what I believe is that DLP is good, but it's not enough, and it's something akin to relying on a Maginot Line of defense. And I think we need to be thinking in terms of increasing deterrence to stop folks from doing the things that lead to breaches and leaks and IP theft. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on through the presentation as well. Last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of impacts was just to tie it back to fraud. I mentioned that I find it to be particularly insidious. It's also particularly damaging. If you look at the numbers on the slide, we're talking about 5% of revenues. We can talk about, losses ranging from the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. These are the types of things that can really have a material impact on a company. If it's a small company, it could have it could be a threat to the company's very existence. If it's a larger company, the cost may be more in terms of somebody that doesn't get hired or some folks that lose their jobs simply because the bottom line was impacted. So I think the numbers on the slide kind of speak for themselves here, and I think we have to do a better job of detecting and responding to fraud in particular. Finding it earlier and dealing with it is challenging, but there are ways that we can do that. So with that said, enough about the damage that can occur. I'm going to throw it back to Jim here for a few minutes, and he's going to start to walk you through how we can start to address these issues.
Okay, another point we want to make, the CERT manages an insider attack database, 700 cases across all sectors. And it's not just sophisticated crime that you worry about, it's low-tech attacks, modifying or stealing data. Another thing that came out of this database, of over half of the instances were adjudicated and the insider was found guilty. And as Mike said earlier, IT sabotage, destroying equipment or data, intellectual property theft, sometimes involving outside coercion, fraud, and miscellaneous. So the numbers speak for themselves. This is the real deal. And a key question is, if you had to investigate an insider-related threat, what tools do you rely on? Okay. Mike, our customers obviously rely on logs, email archive, monitoring software, and SIEM. How about you?
Okay, we'll give you just a moment to point and click, and then we'll take a look at the results. You can see that's a pretty even split there between logs, email archive, and monitoring software.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that's reflective of the different techniques that folks are using to try to wrestle with, which is a very difficult problem to deal with.
Okay, so SEI used the CyberWatch survey information and their insider threat database, and 2 years ago they published the Common Sense Guide to Managing Insider Threats. Great publication. I heard one of the authors speak at a conference. I highly recommend it. It's easy to skim and has a lot of valuable information. One point it makes, incidents reflect the range of insider behavior. It could be a malicious problem with an employee. They could be coerced because of financial or personal reasons, or it could just be an inadvertent mistake. In any case, it's a wide range of activity. The other thing is it introduces a number of practices that can help you address this. Each practice has challenges associated with it, along with suggested protective measures. They provide a case study for each practice, and the most important thing, they provide quick wins, things you can do in that practice area readily that can help improve your posture. And finally, all of these practices are mapped to NIST, ISO, and the CERT standards, so you can use them in most frameworks that people are using. I think we want to take a little bit closer look at some of the practices that most directly impact us. For me, if you're building a response plan, number one thing, consider insider threats in your enterprise-wide risk assessment. In the risk assessment, evaluate known assets, look at access authorities, redundancies, especially checks and balances, and where you have potential, you need to build out the plan. Another key thing, and again, this deals with your security architecture, but it also deals with your response plan. Know your assets. Where are all the critical information systems? Where is the data stored? Where is it backed up? Where's the intellectual property? Who has access? Do you share it with your partners? Do they give you protection? All of these things are really critical, and they come into play not only in continuity of operations, but response to an incident. Oh, good. Here's one, Mike.
Yeah, and this is one, when you look at the practices and the ones we chose to highlight today, this is the one that I find the most interesting, and I think it's probably the least implemented in practice out there, because it's not something that's immediately obvious. Disgruntled employees or folks that are dissatisfied present a huge risk inside an organization. And I don't know that lots of companies do a good job of planning to deal with those things. And if you think about something as routine as a less than stellar review, is the company planning for the person receiving that review to potentially act out in a way that is risky or even beyond risky, could do the company harm? I mean, a lot of times things like a bad review, careers going off a little bit of track, perceived unfair treatment in the workplace, can motivate people to look for another job. They can motivate folks to even strike out on their own. And if you think about just people in general and how you view your work, a lot of times there's a sense of ownership on work product. I was more years ago than I care to recall, I guess. I was in sales, and I'll tell you that there's a mindset in sales where the company, the account information, customer information that you're building in a database, people think that's theirs because they produced it. You see it sometimes in development. I work at a software company. You have coders who are very proud of the code they write, but it came from their mind. They wrote it, so they have a sense of ownership or a sense of entitlement to it. And so you have to think about when you're dealing with issues that may pop up, negative issues. One of the biggest ones is if rumors of a layoff or a RIF are going through a company, you really start to see some sketchy behavior. So these are things you have to be aware of, and you have to deal with them proactively. So if you step back and say, okay, we're going to give Joe a less than stellar review, we need to keep a closer eye on Joe for a little while just to make sure that doesn't set him on the wrong path. It just starts to make sense. And so at the bottom of the slide you see there, consider any of these as an incident, and that incident is going to require you to keep a closer eye on the situation. A great example is found, and we have it up on the slide here, and there's a link there that you can go to, but we had an ex-Intel employee that ended up pleading guilty to theft charges, and you can see at the last bullet on that slide, he's going to be paying a price. But this was somebody that was disgruntled and ended up taking a bunch of information and was trying to take it to a competitor. In this case, the competitor did not have any involvement in it. We've seen cases. We actually have customers that we've seen where the competitors were involved. And you can see the value of the trade secrets that Intel, the value that Intel placed on them. This was a very serious issue for Intel. As I looked at this, and you've heard us talk about CERT and Carnegie Mellon and SEI already. The folks up there do some incredible work, and I looked at a study. It's called Insider Theft of Intellectual Property for Business Advantage, and showed that over half, 56% of the folks in that study. These were folks that felt they either had ownership in something or were owed something by the company, took their, whatever they did, they took their IP, or in this case, the trade secrets this guy was taking within 1 month of resignation. We talked about that bad habit a little bit earlier. Folks, there's a window of time when we are most at risk, and that window varies from one employee to the next. As I looked through that study, I'm going to quote from it pretty directly here. It says, an organization's accurate understanding of its risk is directly related to its ability to detect, the insider's actions, which will, with sufficient levels of technical and behavioral monitoring, may be discoverable. And it really kind of hits home. That's something, if you step back and think about when you have employee issues, are you taking the proper security measures around that? I know a lot of times the focus when somebody's leaving is not really on the security of the company. It's more on transition planning and replacement hiring. So definitely something to keep an eye on. I talked a little bit about folks leaving the company. We saw the survey data earlier on. We talked about the 56% within 1 month of resigning on the previous slide. There is a high-risk exit period that happens at the end of an employee life cycle. And if you look at the Practice 14, one of the ones we chose to highlight here, develop a comprehensive employee termination procedure. I think a lot of you probably didn't get on the phone thinking you were going to get some HR advice today, but I would get your HR people and really talk about this as a serious problem if you don't have a plan in place. I would recommend that you look for signs of employee flight risk. Look for indications that somebody may be getting ready to leave. As Jim mentioned, have up-to-date access and asset tracking readily available so that if you do see an issue, you can make sure that the doors are closed and locked that need to be and you're aware of what's in that person's possession. And then have this consistent process for offboarding. And it is very important to make sure that you go through the steps of reminding people of the agreements, the confidentiality agreements, IP agreements that they've signed, and to walk them out in a dignified way as they leave, in a professional way, and to respect them, but to make sure that you're protecting the interests of the company as you do that. It can be as simple as a checklist in a smaller company. As more people get involved, it might become bigger, but if we know 1 out of 2 people are going to take something with them, we know we need to keep close tabs on them. We need to know who they are. And you can start to see how these things all tie together. Disgruntlement in an employee can lead to flight risk. Inappropriate behavior can lead to flight risk. And then statistically speaking, we see these high incidences of IP and data theft. So it all starts to tie together. And for me, if you walk back to the beginning of that employee life cycle, where you're doing background checks, you're checking references, maybe you're doing a credit check, there may be a cup that you hand to potential employees with instructions on what they can do with it. You're certainly put them through a number of interviews. We need to apply that same level or even higher level of due caution at the exit period because we have more at risk. And as I said, a lot of the times the focus when someone's leaving the company is on making sure that someone else is going to pick up the work, that there's a transition in place, you're moving on to hire in the replacement, and oftentimes we don't pause and take the time to deal with the security aspects around that. So it's something I think we do need to look at a little bit more closely. So with that, we asked a little bit earlier about your incident response plan and did you have one in place. For the folks that have one, does it have special provisions for dealing with an insider threat?
And Mike, a lot of the plans I've looked at with my colleagues don't address it separately. It's part of it, but I think in some cases it's better to call it out. And if you look at federal government plans, because of FSMA, a lot of them do include special issues around privacy, and they address some of the breach questions, but not the causal questions. So it really could be beefed up in most plans.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the results. Thank you, everyone, for voting. And you see, that's pretty clear. Something like 3/4 of the audience are saying no on that.
Yes, and I'd love to hear more details from the folks that said yes. By the way, so one of the other practices is include extended team members in planning and response. If it's an insider threat, governance is critical. Consistent action is critical. Consistent actions are defensible, and if legal action is required, you need defensible actions. Include HR, legal, physical security. The response team needs to incorporate all aspects of the organization. Oh, which brings us to privileged users, Mike.
Yeah, and these are kind of the ultimate insiders, if you think about it. And I think, Jim, that previous slide had a lot of good information on it about the folks that need to be in the room. And I really encourage folks, especially the 75% that don't have special provisions, to look at that and start bringing those folks into their planning if they don't already do so. So privileged users, highly privileged users, super users, we use lots of different terms for the folks that have the ultimate keys to the kingdom. Right, and I believe, and I'm not sure if I'm quoting Voltaire or Spider-Man's dad, that with great power comes great responsibility. But I also think there needs to be increased scrutiny. So you've heard me sort of emphasize the words deter and detect a little bit on previous slides. I want to talk about one more D word here, which is detail. If you go back again to that definition of insider threat as proper access used improperly, well, how about somebody that has really, really exceptional access, almost unfettered access in some cases? The greater the access you give to people they have, the greater the need to inspect what they're doing with it. In the case of highly privileged folks, especially those that kind of exist outside of the standard checks and balances. If you think about maybe a folder or a network share that HR uses to keep information on. So typically only HR can see what's in that network share, except you probably have some admins that can get in there too. So they're outside of that normal checks and balance. Their role doesn't dictate that they should have access to that information. So you really need to look at the actions of highly privileged users in detail more regularly, I think, than anyone else. And a lot of times when I talk about this, people will say to me, Mike, shouldn't you just trust your employees and trust these folks? And I do think, yes, we need to trust people. But I also think that trust, like hope, is not really high up on the list of good strategies that you can count on. And we've seen, as we talked about earlier, that trust doesn't always work out in terms of people coming in and their life circumstances changing and them coming up with actions that we maybe did not anticipate with them. So the 3 Ds up on the slide here. We talk about these a lot here at SpectorSoft, and they really do apply well to insider threats. And I'm gonna step out of technology world for a minute, and just informally, you can answer this poll question to yourself. Have you ever been inside a casino? If you are, or if you have been, well, if you are now, good for you. But if you have been, then you're aware of the eye in the sky systems that these places have. The cameras they're ubiquitous. You can't get away from them. Everything you do in there is going to be observed and recorded. And there's a good parallel here for what I think is an appropriate way of dealing with insider threat, and it applies specifically to Practice 10 with monitoring policies on privileged users, and Practice 12, which among other things encourages you to log, monitor, and audit employee actions. So if you think about these 3 D words, the first is detect. And you need to be able to detect insider risk as it metastasizes, or hopefully before it does, into insider threat. We talked about fraud earlier. Fraud can be detected. There are this well-known way that people communicate when they're engaging in fraudulent behavior. You can find those keywords and phrases in the communications fabric of your company. You can alert on them if you're looking for them. So there are detection methods that work to find insider threats that you might otherwise miss. The next step on this 3D's life cycle is detail. And you want to be able to look at an employee's actions in detail when necessary. I believe that highly privileged users, it's almost always necessary to do so. But in general, if you have a suspicion, if you think that something may be going on, if you're seeing alerts on the way someone's communicating, for example, or we talked about earlier, somebody potentially getting ready to leave the company, you want to have a detailed view into what they're doing. That's going to let you answer a lot of questions that you need to answer, but it's also going to give you a contextual understanding of their actions, and that's very important. It can help cut down on false positives that might otherwise spit out, and really give you a good handle on what people are doing. And then the final D, and we talked about it a little bit, is deter. And deterrence for me is an underutilized security best practice that I would encourage folks to really take a good hard look at. So what you're looking at up here on this slide is some research that was done by some very smart folks at the Sentencing Project. And what they saw in their studies is that the more certain it is that somebody's going to get caught, the less likely they are to do the thing that would get them in trouble. Or the way I sometimes say it, if I think I can get away with it, I'm more likely to try. So I was thinking about this a little bit, and I went to the dictionary and I looked at the different definitions of deterrence. And one of them is the act of making someone decide not to do something. And I think that is an area that we can do a much better job on. I read an article on, I believe it was Wired not that long ago. It said 75% of employee-related crimes go unnoticed. So a couple of things jump out at me from that. One, the numbers we talked about earlier on insider-related crimes are probably vastly understated. And two, we're not really doing a good job of changing people's minds, of letting them know you're going to get caught. Think about that eye in the sky in a casino. It serves three purposes. It's there to help security detect something as it occurs, a threat, a risk for the casino, and deal with it. It records that evidence for evidentiary purposes in detail, and then that can be used, whether it's prosecutorially or to go back and review security procedures and tighten them up. But it also serves as a deterrent. The vast majority of folks are going to walk in, see those cameras, and say, not here. I'm not going to get away with it, whatever it was. Ben Affleck seemed to think he was above this rule. But the vast majority of folks are just going to be deterred by the presence, the certainty of getting caught. And Jim, I think you had something you wanted to add here, if I recall.
Well, there are a couple of thoughts that come to mind, but I'll stick with a simple one. The old adage, people do what you inspect, not what you expect. And I think here, just because we expect them to behave properly doesn't mean they will.
Well said. Well said.
All right, so one last item in this area, handling of evidence. With an insider, you're likely to terminate, and you might litigate, and you may go for legal action, and you need to handle all of the records with evidence in mind. Chain of custody. If someone's got a copy of the log and they put it on a disc, CD, you lock it in a vault to make sure you can have that chain of custody. You need to preserve email. And maintenance of the metadata that's in the file system, not in the file. So it's a very important part when you're dealing with insiders.
That's well said, Jim. So hopefully this was good information, and we've exposed you to some things that maybe got you thinking, and some resources that you can use. But Jim, why don't we step out here for a couple of minutes, and why don't you kind of let the folks know how coordinated response helps with the types of issues we're dealing with.
Thanks, Mike. Coordinated Response is an incident response planning and consulting firm. We help organizations create an incident plan or improve it, and we have tools to help automate and manage it. We use our response management framework to help develop effective plans, and it starts with the incident categories and types the team is responsible for. It's almost their statement of work, their scope of responsibility. And again, we encourage a well-defined response team, including not just the incident handlers, which is what most people think of, but the extended team members, the governance. One CISO I know says, get legal involved. If you've got legal counsel and they are aware of the potential risks, they will be a major advocate, both for security controls and for a good response plan. The plan has to define all the actions for preparation, detection, analysis, containment, and having them predefined makes it much more likely they'll get executed properly. And again, what I said earlier, the risk assessment helps with the impact areas and the impact metrics, and that helps with prioritization. So we use the framework to look at your plan or your organization to create an effective response, or what we call a coordinated response. Mike, how does SpectorSoft help?
Sure, thanks, Jim. So SpectorSoft, we're a software company, and we make user activity monitoring software. So we can give you the ability to monitor everything that a person, a group of people, company-wide, how people interact with the IT resources they're given, with the accesses they're given. And you can see up on the slide some of the different bits of information that we collect and record. We can monitor just about everything people do on the corporate network. In short, we help you detect, detail, and deter problems. And there's a lot of uses for the data that we collect outside of security as well. But in terms of this, if you, again, think about the risk presented by people inside an organization, we are looking or helping you look at the people. And they are the source, unfortunately, of a lot of problems, whether it be inadvertent, mischievous, or malicious. We do this through two main products that we offer out. that I was going to talk about here today. The first is a product we're very proud of. We brought it to market fairly recently. In shorthand, we refer to it as Recon, and it's what I would call a passive monitoring solution, very close to logging, but we are logging employee activity. So we're recording all those things that you saw on the previous slide, and those can all be configured, by the way, based on your goals and how you want to proceed. We record it all, we log it securely, and it's there and it's available in case it's necessary. So if you found out, I used Joe as an example earlier, that he was getting ready to leave the company, you could take a look at what Joe had been doing in the previous 30 days, which happens to coincide with when most of the things happen. We're very proud of this solution, and you can see along the bottom some of the things that we integrate with, and also some of the recent awards that we won, including SC Magazine Europe and Best of Interop Award that we're quite proud of. The other solution that is very widely deployed, in this we're talking about upwards of 7,000 companies running this product. Spector 360 is our flagship product. It is more of an active monitoring solution, and by active, in contrast to Recon, this is designed for people that want to be looking at the activity on a regular basis, reviewing it, potentially retaining it. So if you think about someone in that high-risk exit period, you might want to actively monitor them. Privileged users we talked about earlier may be candidates for active monitoring. And again, we're focused on the human factor, and that lets us provide context that other solutions just can't see. So that's just a little bit about SpectorSoft, and I think as we come to the end of our slides here, and I think there's two more left, just as a summary, the insider threat folks is a difficult one to deal with. People are hard to secure. I said it earlier. Jim and I are not here to make any silver bullet claims, but I think what we can say confidently is that you need tools, and I certainly believe that my solution is one that needs to be in your kit, and you need a plan. And I think Jim's approach and the way that coordinated response goes about things is one that's easy to implement. And you need a plan that's consistently and constantly tested and improved. So that's the sort of summary there, Jim. I'm going to kind of leave it with you to wrap up with a couple of numbers that sort of tie this all together.
Okay, so the $188 is the cost per individual if an individual's name and data is breached. That's from Verizon, and it actually went up to $194 last year. The Ponemon Institute says you can reduce that cost by 25% if you have an effective plan. Verizon says the number of data breaches, the number of names in a data breach has gone up 680%, 7 times in the last 5 years. And by the way, individual data is the key target for cyber criminals, key target. Verizon goes on to say, if you detect it early, and there are signs already available, and you're able to eradicate it, you have an 80% chance of avoiding all data breach expense. So the signs are there. Sometimes we let them go for too long, and the problem occurs, and the data is gone. So that brings us to the survey.
Yes, thank you so much, Jim and Mike, for those insights. This will be a good time, if you haven't already, to put up a question for our speakers to answer. But before we go on to Q&A, please fill out the feedback form, which is open on your computer. To complete the form, press the Submit Answer button at the bottom of the page. Now, on to the question and answer portion of our event. Just a reminder, if you want to participate, just type your question into the text box located below the media player and press the Submit Question button. Let me kick it off here. I was wondering, Jim or Mike, if you could give an example of how a customer has actually used your solution to respond to an incident.
Sure, and I'll go first. And I'm actually going to talk about an incident that was not everything that it appeared to be. We had a customer tell us a story once. They had a very high-performing sales rep, and they do keep an eye on different network activities, and they noticed a spike in the amount of files that this rep was downloading from a particular server. And they went and took a little bit of a closer look, and they noticed that it was customer lists, and it happened to be customer lists broken out by state for all 50 states in the U.S. And this was concerning to them because this rep obviously didn't cover all 50 states, and they were concerned why somebody would be pulling this information down. They did have our software in place, so they started to go back and look at the videotape, if you will. And one of the things they observed is that these 50 files were being attached to emails and sent out to a Gmail address with a note that said something like, "Here are the files you asked for." So just about panic set in, and they were both upset that they had a problem and that they were going to lose a top-performing rep. One of the folks that uses our software went back in time a little bit and tried to look at what this individual was doing leading up to downloading the files to try to get an understanding of the scope of the problem they were dealing with. And what they saw was actually an email come in to the rep from that Gmail. And what it turned out was her boss was at a meeting in another location. His laptop was down. He needed those files for the meeting. And he was asking her to send them to a Gmail account that he could pull them down from another machine. And so it turned out to not be an incident at all, but it was something they did need to look at. And I thought it was a real good example of the contextual understanding that our software can add around other methods of detection to help folks get to the answers right away. And Jim, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that. I'm going to take that as a no.
Okay, well, let me move on.
Yeah, that was a no.
Okay, you've explained very, very clearly, I think, what your solutions are, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how customers go about actually implementing the solutions.
Yeah, so I'll go first here, and then I'd like to hear from Jim too, because I think there's some overlap here. One of the things that I always tell people when they're looking to bring our solution in is that you need a mix of people and process. We talked about tools and a plan earlier. I encourage people to pull the same types of folks that Jim is talking about having in the room for dealing an insider threat, legal, HR, into the process of rolling out an employee monitoring solution. There are questions that you're going to have to deal with. There's a question about, is it legal? And I can speak to the U.S. with high confidence that everything in the U.S. is premised on an expectation of privacy or a reasonable expectation of privacy. And the overwhelming majorities of U.S. companies, whether they're using monitor or software or not, do a very good job of destroying that expectation with acceptable use policies and electronic resource agreements and things that are clicked on to acknowledge and log on that tell people you have no expectation of privacy on corporate resources. But there is a process you want to put in place, and then you also want to make sure that you're using the software and aligning it to your goals. So, if you're worried about sensitive information being moved inappropriately, you're going to want to set up your monitoring scheme to deal with that. But you may not really care what your employees are doing on the internet. That you're not worried about productivity per se. So just don't monitor for it. We give you the options within the solution to do that. So I always encourage folks to align their monitoring plan with their goals. And if you're talking about insider threat security, there are very specific things you should monitor for. The use of the language of fraud would be an example. Then there's other things you might just choose not to. So that's the kind of the process that I encourage folks to go through when they're looking to implement a solution like ours. Jim, do you want to add anything about the process of kind of standing up an insider response plan?
Well, yes. We always start with the incident handlers, what we'll call the core team. But we very quickly move to the extended team, and you can almost consider it a tabletop exercise. You've got your incident handlers, you've got somebody from legal, somebody from HR, and of course these are people you want to be part of the incident response team, not just liaisons. You get the extended team there, and you have the handlers describe what they see, what they do, and it's an eye-opener for the extended team. And they start raising questions. The HR might say, we need to change the acceptable use policy if you're going to do that. And legal says, that's fine, but what about this? And so it's really, and they start listing actions and approval authorities that are required. That's not the final draft, that's the first draft. So we use our tools very flexibly to morph the plan as they go through iterations, almost an agile approach. So that's how we proceed.
There was just a follow-up, Mike. Interested to have the impression that you're talking about some kind of semantic monitoring. You able to go in there and look for kind of revealing terms which might show a pattern of the kind of behavior you're concerned about?
Yeah, that is one of the things one of the areas that we have capability in, and it's an area. You mentioned during the introduction that I work on product strategy. It's an area that we're putting a lot of focus on to beef up the sophistication on that. But I guess suffice to say, there's a lot you can learn in that. I've used the term a couple times now, and I apologize if I'm a little bit of a broken record. But the online and communications fabric of your company, and as long as you're looking for it. So I think, yes, we can look for keywords and phrases. We've actually spent a good amount of time building lists that people can implement, based on best practices, based on known usage. Fraud would be one. Certainly inappropriate language or harassing type behavior, which could lead to litigation risk and employee flight risk. There's a lot of out-of-box content available in the solutions to make it easier for folks to get started.
Interesting follow-on from that when you're thinking of people talking to each other. Somebody in the audience is asking what your thoughts are about a coordinated insider threat involving multiple employees.
Yeah, and that's, Jim, do you want to say something?
Well, it's actually something that you triggered in my mind, Mike. It's the fact that when you're about to lay off an employee, you don't want to just worry about that employee. You want to worry about that employee's peers because they may feel anger and resentment. But a coordinated, I hate to say this, but a coordinated threat rises to a much higher level. And I'd be curious, Mike, how those kind of patterns might be exposed in your tools.
Yeah, so it's actually, and I appreciate the question. That's one of the things as I talk to customers that our software is used for very regularly. So a lot of times, companies will rely on different mechanisms for coming to the conclusion that they have to investigate an employee or take a closer look at their activity. And it may be a tip from a fellow employee. It could be a change in behavior or something that's observed. But a lot of times what they find when they engage in that investigation is tentacles, is things are coordinated. And so, our customers are looking at who is the person, the subject of the investigation, communicating with? Is that their normal communication pattern, or has it shifted lately? And even at times the content of those communications to make sure that this is not a problem that is spread from one person, out to 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's a very common use case for our software, and we hear that quite frequently from our customers.
There's a question from the audience which broadens this out in an interesting way. They're asking if there's a 50-50 chance of losing intellectual property with employees in the U.S., how much does that increase if you start to use partners and contractors overseas?
Well, let me take that one, Mike. The studies and the surveys include employees and partners as part of the insider threat. I don't know how often that reflects an international component. But the Verizon data breach report does include all across the globe. So a lot of the data breach numbers are pretty consistent. So it may well be that, it's included. But I don't know that for sure. And Mike, you have good experience, at least in Europe and other nations. What do you see?
I don't know that I have a good handle on it that I would want to be able to say anything directly. And certainly the way we looked at it in the presentation, I don't even believe the survey data that I did when we surveyed customers, or actually we surveyed the non-customers on our survey. I would even have to go back and look at the sample size included. International was U.S. only. So unfortunately, I don't think I can give a great answer there. It's a great question.
Okay, here's something quite specific. Somebody's asking about activities which come through VPNs. Do they create any special problems?
And I'm going to give a qualified no, they do not. I would want to have a fuller conversation with that asker just to make sure that there was nothing particularly unique in a setup. But they should not present any challenges that our software would not be able to deal with. Jim,
and Mike, my experience would confirm that.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question, and Kim, if you don't mind, there's a question there that I thought I'd pull out. Someone asked about it. It's kind of, I spoke to it a little bit. The legality of what you can view, and I wanted to speak to that a little bit. We talked about, Jim mentioned having legal in the room when you're standing up your incident response plan, particularly with insiders, and I couldn't agree more. And I think you want legal in the room to help you sort of guide your decisions on what you're going to review and when. For the most part, again, in the U.S., privacy is premised on an expectation of privacy, and that is regularly destroyed. But local jurisdictions vary. Germany, for example, they don't come at privacy from the same view as the U.S. at all, and they have requirements that a works council be involved and a privacy officer be involved if you're going to review user activity. So there are ways of doing it, and it just has to be done in the right way. So I think the question to approach there is not so much is it legal, but how do we do it in a way that is legal? And I would encourage folks to have legal in the room to help with those questions, particularly if you're in a multinational situation, because laws vary quite widely.
And I heard Richard Clark speak, and he made the comment that we won't have security until we figure out how to protect privacy.
That's a really great way to bring things to a conclusion. Jim and Mike, thank you so much again for the discussion today, and thank you to everyone for attending. There are two resources on the screen now. You can visit those for any more information, and within the next 24 to 48 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details, a link to today's presentation, and you can view today's event on demand by visiting www.darkreading.com/events. So thank you again for attending the webinar, Insider Threats, How to Find Them Early and Fix Them Fast, brought to you by SpectorSoft and Dark Reading. This webinar is copyright 2014 by United Business Media Limited. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted, if that's the case, by SpectorSoft and Dark Reading, who are solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests Mike Tierney and Jim Mayer, I'm Kim Davis. Thanks for your time and have a great day.